Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him. He failed. A hospital tried to revive him. It failed.
For more than 30 years, nobody outside a locked room in Memphis knew what really happened to the king of rock and roll in his final hours on the embalming table. The details were sealed, the witnesses stayed silent, and the world was told only what it needed to hear. Then, 3 decades later, one man's private collection surfaced, and forced the world to ask what exactly had been kept hidden and why. August 16, 1977 began as an ordinary afternoon at Graceland. Nothing about it suggested it would end as one of the most mourned days in American cultural history. Around lunchtime, Ginger Alden went looking for Elvis and found him collapsed on the bathroom floor, motionless. Within moments, the estate erupted into chaos. An ambulance was called, and paramedics arrived to find a scene far more dire than a routine emergency call. They rushed him into the vehicle and began CPR immediately, refusing to stop as they raced toward Baptist Memorial Hospital. Oxygen was administered the entire way, the crew fighting against time on every city block. At the hospital, a team of physicians took over instantly, cycling through every resuscitation protocol available to them. But nothing worked. By 3:30 in the afternoon, doctors made the call that the world wasn't ready to hear. Elvis Presley was gone. The news didn't stay contained for long. Within the hour, it had ripped through Memphis and out across the wires, and the hospital grounds transformed into something closer to a riot than a place of medicine. Grief-stricken fans and aggressive photographers descended on the property in the thousands, choking the roads and overwhelming the gates. Security, never built for anything like this, simply buckled. In the pandemonium, one especially bold fan managed to slip past distracted guards and get inside the room where Elvis's body was being kept. Hospital staff were stretched impossibly thin, torn between managing an overwhelmed emergency department and trying to hold back a crowd that had no intention of leaving. In a moment almost too strange to believe, that intruding fan tore the identification tag off his toe and walked out with it, a macabre trophy taken in the middle of a national tragedy, snatched from a body that hadn't even been moved to the morgue yet. When hospital staff discovered the tag was missing, real fear set in. If someone could walk in and steal a piece of evidence that easily, what else might happen before the body could be moved somewhere safer? The staff scrambled for a solution. They wrote up a fresh tag under a fictitious name, labeling him simply as John Doe, hoping the decoy would throw off anyone still searching the wards for the real thing. But the hospital itself had become the problem. With security compromised and a mob outside demanding answers, the decision was made to relocate the body entirely. Staff routed the transfer away from the main roads, avoiding the crush of reporters, and made their way quietly to the Memphis Funeral Home. The handoff there was rushed and tense. So tense, in fact, that the funeral home employee responsible for the intake paperwork signed off on custody of the remains without lifting the sheet to confirm who was actually underneath it. Nobody in that room had the composure left to slow down and double-check. The priority was simple: get the body inside, out of sight, before the chaos outside found its way in. Once the doors were sealed, only 2 people were allowed anywhere near the body: the funeral home's senior embalmer and his assistant, a man named Hamilton. Management gave them one unambiguous order: whatever happened in that room, whatever they saw or did, was never to leave it. To enforce that, the funeral home effectively became a fortress overnight. Guards were posted at every door, every window, every alley entrance, a level of lockdown nobody in that building had ever seen before, all in service of keeping the location and condition of Elvis's body a secret from a world hungry for details. While the embalming room was being prepared, a delivery arrived at the back of the building. A casket personally commissioned by Vernon Presley for his son. It was an enormous, custom-built vault of bronze and copper, deliberately matching the one used for Elvis's mother years before. It took a small crew just to maneuver the half-ton box through the doors. With the casket in place and armed guards holding the perimeter, the senior embalmer turned to the table and began the most consequential work of his career, with no idea that decades later, the tools in his hands would become physical evidence in a controversy nobody could have predicted. What greeted the embalmer and his assistant was not an easy case. Years of cardiovascular strain had visibly reshaped Elvis's body, and the swelling from his final heart failure was severe. Both men understood the weight of what they were doing. This wasn't a case that would quietly pass through their hands unnoticed. Millions of people were going to file past this casket, and every visible detail would be studied and remembered for generations. So they spent hours working simply to restore some resemblance of the man the public remembered. His hair, which had been steadily going gray under the strain of his declining health in his last months, was dyed back to the deep black that had defined his image since the 1950s. Attention then shifted to his face, where the trauma of both the cardiac event and the invasive autopsy that followed had left visible marks. Heavy cosmetic work was required to smooth over the damage, so that when the casket was finally opened to the public, Elvis would look composed rather than ravaged. Once his appearance had been restored as closely as possible, they dressed him in a white suit, a specific choice made by Vernon Presley, who wanted his son presented at his most dignified for the millions who would eventually file past the casket. Somewhere in the middle of all this careful, exhausting work, the senior embalmer made a decision nobody had authorized and nobody would know about for over 30 years. Rather than disposing of the tools used in the procedure as standard practice required, he quietly set some aside, lip brushes, forceps, needle injectors, and tucked them into a private box. He took that box home with him that night, hiding a small piece of one of the most significant nights in American pop culture history inside his own house while the rest of the country was still absorbing the loss. Years rolled by. The funeral home carried on with its normal business, with no idea that a set of instruments tied to Elvis's final preparation sat quietly in a private residence nearby. The collection stayed out of public view for so long it seemed destined to simply disappear into the background of history, forgotten even by most of the people who had been in that building the night it happened, until the approach of the 33rd anniversary of Elvis's death changed everything. In July 2010, a well-known Chicago auction house, Leslie Hindman Auctioneers, made an announcement that caught almost everyone off guard. This wasn't going to be a typical celebrity memorabilia sale featuring stage costumes, guitars, or gold records. Instead, the entire lot centered on medical instruments used directly on Elvis Presley the night he died. The timing was clearly no accident. The auction was scheduled for August 12th, just 4 days ahead of the 33rd anniversary of his death, precisely when fans from around the world would already be converging on Memphis for the annual tribute events. The announcement detonated across the press almost immediately, with people struggling to understand how something this personal and clinical had managed to stay hidden for over 3 decades before suddenly surfacing for sale. It didn't take long to trace where the items had come from. The collection belonged to the now-retired senior embalmer from the Memphis Funeral Home and his son, who had kept it locked away for more than 30 years, apparently waiting for the moment they judged most valuable to bring it into the open. When the full catalog was published, the specifics stunned even seasoned collectors. Used rubber gloves, metal aneurysm hooks, a comb, cosmetic eyeliner, and, perhaps most jarring of all, the backup John Doe toe tag from that chaotic night at the hospital. What really turned heads, though, wasn't just the strangeness of the items, it was the money. Auction analysts projected the two lots could fetch upward of $14,000 combined, a number that underlined just how far the market for celebrity memorabilia had drifted into genuinely uncomfortable territory, where even clinical waste from someone's final hours could carry a 5-figure price tag. Collectors and devoted fans alike started preparing to bid, drawn by the idea of owning something that had made physical contact with Elvis in his final hours. For some, it wasn't about the macabre novelty at all. It was the closest thing to a physical connection they would ever have with someone whose music had shaped their entire lives. Anticipation built steadily in the days leading up to the sale, and so did the backlash. Behind the scenes, a legal fight was already taking shape. E.C. Daves, president of the Memphis Funeral Home, was reportedly outraged when he learned what was about to go up for bidding. He moved quickly to publicly oppose the sale, arguing that it represented a serious ethical breach and a direct affront to the Presley family's dignity. The legal teams that followed didn't just argue about propriety, they went after the authenticity of the items themselves. The retired embalmer insisted the tools were genuinely the ones used on Elvis, kept deliberately as a personal memento of an unforgettable night. But former colleagues from the funeral home pushed back hard, pointing out that standard procedure at the time called for medical instruments to be sterilized and reused across multiple cases. If that protocol had been followed as described, there was no way to guarantee these specific tools had touched Elvis and no one else, which cast real doubt over the entire premise of the sale. Even setting authenticity aside, there was a more fundamental legal obstacle waiting. Attorneys representing the funeral home's parent company argued that any equipment used during a professional mortuary procedure was, by definition, corporate property, not something an individual technician was entitled to walk away with. Since the embalmer had been an employee acting within the scope of his job in 1977, the argument went he never had legal ownership of those tools in the first place, let alone the right to hand them down to his son for a profitable resale decades later. The company made it clear it intended to fight for that property in court if necessary. The pressure worked. Just days before bidding was set to open in Chicago, the auction house pulled the plug and canceled the sale outright. The media spotlight that had been building for weeks vanished almost overnight. In the aftermath, the retired embalmer was reportedly compelled to hand the entire collection back over to the funeral home's parent company to head off a lawsuit. The auction itself never happened, but it had already done something else entirely. It reignited public curiosity about what the official medical records actually said about how Elvis died. Once the legal drama around the auction settled down, attention shifted back to where it arguably should have been all along: the findings of the original medical examination performed in August 1977. The embalmer's tools might have made headlines, but the real answers about Elvis's death had been sitting in clinical records compiled by the pathologist who examined him in the hours after he was pronounced dead. Those findings, once they became widely known, painted a much more sobering picture than the polished public image most fans held onto. The official autopsy documented a heart enlarged by roughly a third beyond normal size, a serious abnormality on its own. Doctors attributed that strain largely to advanced atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries, likely compounded by years of poorly managed high blood pressure. Taken together, the medical consensus pointed to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia as the immediate cause of death on the bathroom floor that afternoon. But the heart was only part of the story. What the pathologist documented next in his digestive system was, by most accounts, even more disturbing. Dr. George Nichopoulos and the examining team found evidence of severe, long-standing constipation, not a minor, everyday discomfort, but a serious and advanced medical problem that had apparently been building for a long time without proper treatment. The clinical term for what they found was megacolon, a large intestine so distended it measured roughly double its normal width and length, and packed with impacted material that had clearly been accumulating for months. His digestive system had essentially stopped functioning properly, unable to clear waste at anything resembling a normal rate. Doctors pointed to two likely contributing factors: a lifetime of heavy, fat-laden comfort food and prolonged heavy use of prescription opiates, both of which can severely slow digestive function over time. These revelations quietly put to rest a lot of the wilder conspiracy theories that had circulated for years about how Elvis actually died. But they also raised an uncomfortable new question that the public wasn't ready to let go of. How had his personal physician allowed his health to deteriorate this far without intervening? That question found its answer once the official toxicology results became public. The lab work revealed a dense mixture of pharmaceuticals in his system at the time of death, more than 9 separate prescription sedatives and painkillers, including significant amounts of Demerol and codeine. The sheer volume of medication on board was, by itself, a stark indicator of just how much chronic pain Elvis appears to have been managing in the final stretch of his life while still trying to maintain a grueling performance schedule that gave him almost no room to properly rest or recover between shows. Physicians who later reviewed the case offered a possible explanation for why these particular drugs proved so dangerous. Evidence pointed to a possible genetic liver condition that would have made it extremely difficult for his body to metabolize codeine properly. Without the right enzymes to break the drug down efficiently, it could build up to toxic concentrations far faster than it would in someone without that impairment, meaning doses that might be unremarkable for an average patient could pose serious risk for him specifically. That same medication buildup also helped explain something fans had noticed and worried about for years: his visibly swollen, bloated appearance during his last months on stage. Rather than ordinary weight gain, medical experts later linked the change to symptoms consistent with Cushing's disease, not a natural condition, but a known adverse reaction to prolonged, heavy cortisone use, which he had reportedly been taking to manage chronic pain and joint inflammation. Public anger over these findings eventually spilled into the legal system. Investigators turned their focus to Dr. George Nichopoulos, and the case ultimately went to trial over allegations that he had overprescribed enormous quantities of powerful medication to Elvis in his final years. A jury ultimately cleared him of criminal wrongdoing, but the state medical board later revoked his license entirely over the ethics of his prescribing practices, a partial, delayed form of accountability that came years after the fact. In the immediate aftermath of his son's death, Vernon Presley took direct control of how, and how much, the world would ever know about what really happened. He pursued legal action to have the complete, unredacted autopsy report sealed for 50 years, a decision that placed the most detailed medical account of Elvis's death entirely out of reach for historians, journalists, and the general public alike. Under that order, the full files remain legally off-limits until 2027. The motivation behind that decision was deeply personal. Vernon understood that the graphic clinical reality, the addiction, the organ damage, the slow physical collapse, stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, larger-than-life image the world had built around his son. Exposing that reality in full, he believed, risked permanently reshaping how Elvis would be remembered. Faced with that choice, the family opted for privacy over disclosure, choosing to protect the legend even at the cost of leaving the full clinical truth locked away. That decision, understandable as it may have been, came with a long-term cost of its own. With no official documentation available to the public, the vacuum was quickly filled by decades of speculation, rumor, and outright conspiracy theory, each one thriving precisely because there was no accessible record to disprove it. For years, that uncertainty turned one of the most painful chapters in American music history into a kind of ongoing spectacle, and the failed 2010 auction of mortuary instruments was, in many ways, just the most visible example of people still trying to profit from that same unresolved mystery decades later. Strip away the internet rumors, the courtroom battles, and the bizarre fight over a box of used medical tools, and what's left is simply the story of a life that ended far too early, under conditions far more painful than most fans ever knew. It's a story that asks us to look past the rhinestones and the spotlight and see the person underneath, someone dealing with real, escalating physical suffering long before that August afternoon, hidden behind a stage presence that never let the audience see the toll it was taking. Behind the headlines was a man whose body had quietly been breaking down for years under the demands of his own career. The record suggests not so much a disregard for his own health as a person trapped inside a punishing schedule, relying on an increasingly dangerous mix of prescriptions just to keep functioning while trying to give everything he had left to millions of fans who had no idea how much he was struggling. He was, in the end, a man pushed to the outer edge of what his body could withstand, fighting a private battle against his own deteriorating health until his heart simply stopped on a bathroom floor. The embalmer himself never claimed any special insight into who Elvis really was. But through one quiet, unauthorized decision, he ended up at the center of one of the strangest sagas connected to the singer's legacy. A reminder of just how easily pieces of history can slip out of sealed rooms and into the open decades after the fact, once the right incentive comes along. So here's the question worth sitting with. Did the embalmer get off too easily after trying to profit from items tied to a private, painful moment in someone else's death? Or was quietly returning the collection under legal pressure a fair enough resolution? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if stories like this, the hidden details behind the public lives of iconic figures, are the kind of thing you want more of, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.